The morning sun was just beginning to warm the windows of Pete's Diner, casting long shadows across the worn leather booths and chrome-trimmed counters. It was barely 7 a.m., and the smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air. Mr. Wilson had been coming to this same spot every morning for the past 15 years, ever since he retired from teaching high school history. At 68, he moved a bit slower these days, but his mind was sharp as ever. The bell above the door chimed as he stepped inside, and familiar faces looked up with warm smiles. Rose, the waitress who'd been working there almost as long as he'd been coming, was already reaching for the coffee pot before he could even take his seat. "The usual, Mr. Dardo," she called out, her voice carrying that cheerful morning energy that somehow never seemed to fade, even after all these years. "You know me too well, Rose," he chuckled, settling into his favorite corner booth. The leather seat had a slight dip in it from years of him sitting in the exact same spot, reading his morning paper and watching the world go by through the large window beside him. The regulars at Pete's were like family. There was Bob, the retired mailman who always sat at the counter, telling anyone who'd listen about his grandkids. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door would pop in for her morning tea, often bringing fresh flowers to brighten up the diner. Even the young folks who worked at the garage down the street would stop by, respectfully calling him Mr. Dao, and occasionally asking for advice about life's bigger questions. As Rose brought over his usual wheat toast and black coffee, Mr. Wilson pulled out his phone. His son had promised to call this morning before heading to base. The boy, though at 35, he wasn't really a boy anymore, had made his father proud, serving his country with honor. They hadn't seen each other in person for almost 8 months, and these morning calls had become their special routine. The diner's regular morning chatter created a comfortable backdrop as Mr. Wilson sipped his coffee, spreading a thin layer of butter on his toast. He taught at the local high school for over 3 decades, and there wasn't a week that went by without a former student stopping to say hello. Just yesterday, one of his old students had introduced their own teenager to him, proudly telling stories about his history class and how he'd made them actually want to learn. The morning light streamed through the window, catching the steam rising from his coffee cup. Mr. Wilson smiled as he noticed a young family at a nearby table, the parents patiently teaching their little one how to properly hold a fork. It reminded him of when his own son was that age, full of questions and wonder about the world. His phone buzzed, right on schedule. His son's name appeared on the screen, and Mr. Wilson's face lit up with a warm smile. These morning calls were the highlight of his day, even if they were usually brief. They talked about everything and nothing: the weather, sports scores, local gossip, and his son's life on base. "How's everything at the base?" Mr. Wilson asked, his voice carrying the gentle tone of a father who never stopped worrying about his child, no matter how grown-up they might be. "All good, Pop. Actually, I've got some news." His son started, but before he could finish, the peaceful morning atmosphere was shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycle engines in the parking lot. Mr. Wilson glanced out the window, his expression changing slightly as he saw 3 large bikes pull up, their riders dressed in leather, covered with patches that made his heart sink. He'd read about a group causing trouble in nearby towns, but they'd never shown up here before. "Hey, I'll call you right back," he said quietly into the phone, his instincts from years of teaching telling him to stay calm but alert. What he didn't know was that his son had already ended the call and was closer than anyone could have guessed. The morning sun continued to shine through the windows of Pete's Diner, but the warm, peaceful atmosphere had suddenly shifted. Rose stood behind the counter, coffee pot still in hand, watching the door with concern. Bob had stopped mid-story about his grandkids, and Mrs. Chen held her teacup a little tighter. Mr. Wilson took another sip of his coffee, his movements deliberate and dignified. In his 30 years of teaching, he'd learned that staying calm in tense situations was often the best approach. But as the door's bell chimed again, this time with a harsh jangle, he knew this peaceful morning was about to become anything but ordinary. The rumble of motorcycles seemed to make the diner's windows vibrate as 3 massive bikes pulled into the parking lot. The peaceful morning soundtrack of clinking coffee cups and quiet conversation was drowned out by the aggressive rev of engines, almost like the riders were announcing their presence to everyone within a mile radius. Through the large windows, the diner's customers could see the 3 men dismounting their bikes. Each wore heavy leather jackets despite the warm morning, covered in patches that made several customers shift uncomfortably in their seats. These weren't the friendly weekend riders who sometimes stopped by for breakfast and swapped stories about their road trips. Rose, still holding the coffee pot, moved closer to the counter phone. She'd worked at Pete's long enough to know when trouble was walking through the door. Bob, the retired mailman, slowly turned his stool away from the counter to face the entrance. Even Mrs. Chen set down her teacup, her usually cheerful expression replaced with concern. The bikers took their time outside, adjusting their leather jackets and exchanging looks that suggested they were enjoying the tension they were creating. The tallest one, clearly their leader, had a thick beard and arms covered in faded tattoos. His two companions weren't much smaller, one wearing a bandana and the other sporting a shaved head that gleamed in the morning sun. Mr. Wilson kept his eyes on his newspaper, but his attention was entirely focused on the situation unfolding around him. Years of teaching had taught him to read a room, to sense when tension was building. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, like the heavy air before a storm. The bell above the door rang 3 times as they entered, each one stepping in with heavy boots that seemed to intentionally scuff the freshly mopped floor. The smell of leather and motorcycle exhaust pushed aside the comfortable aroma of coffee and bacon. They stood in the entrance for a moment, scanning the diner like they were sizing up every person present. Well, the leader said, his voice carrying an edge that made several customers stare intently at their plates. Ain't this place just full of interesting folks this morning? The one with the bandana chuckled, but there was no warmth in the sound. It was the kind of laugh that made parents pull their children closer. The Yun family that had been teaching their little one to use a fork quickly asked for their check, keeping their voices low. Mr. Wilson could see Rose's hands trembling slightly as she set down the coffee pot. She dealt with difficult customers before, but these men weren't here for the breakfast special. Their presence alone was like a heavy weight pressing down on everyone in the diner. The trio made their way through the restaurant, boots thudding against the linoleum floor. They passed by Bob, who suddenly found his coffee cup fascinating. Mrs. Chen busied herself with her phone, though her hands were shaking too much to actually use it. The cook, a big man named Phil who'd worked the grill for 20 years, stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron while keeping a watchful eye on the situation. The bikers took their time, moving between the tables like they were on patrol. Their patches, showing symbols that made their beliefs all too clear, seemed to catch the morning light in an almost threatening way. They weren't just looking for trouble, they were hoping to create it. Mr. Wilson remained focused on his newspaper, though he hadn't read a single word since they'd entered. His phone sat silent on the table, the recent call from his son still showing on the screen. He could feel them getting closer to his corner booth, their shadows growing longer across his table. The lever stopped right beside Mr. Wilson's booth, close enough that the older man could smell the leather and cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket. The other two spread out slightly, creating a half circle that effectively blocked any easy exit. "Interesting reading material?" the leader asked, his voice dripping with mock politeness. His finger tapped the edge of Mr. Wilson's newspaper, leaving a smudge on the clean paper. The diner had gone completely silent. Even the usual sizzle from the grill seemed muted, as if the kitchen itself was holding its breath. Through the window, Mr. Wilson could see several regular customers hurrying to their cars, while others sat frozen, unsure whether leaving or staying was the safer choice. What none of them knew, not the bikers, not Rose, not even Mr. Wilson himself, was that at that very moment, a black SUV was turning into the diner's parking lot. Behind its wheel sat someone who had spent years training for situations exactly like this, someone who had made a career out of protecting others from those who would do them harm. The morning sun continued to shine through the windows, casting long shadows across the diner floor. In those shadows, 3 men stood over a peaceful older man's table, their intentions as clear as the hatred displayed on their patches. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had no idea who was about to walk through that door. The morning sun continued to shine through the windows, casting long shadows across the diner floor. In those shadows, Wilson calmly folded his newspaper, his movements deliberate and measured. 30 years of teaching had taught him how to handle tense situations with dignity. He'd faced down angry parents, broken up fights between students, and dealt with his fair share of bullies. These three might be bigger and older than high school troublemakers, but the principle remained the same: never let them see your fear. "I was just finishing up," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the threat looming over his table. He reached for his wallet, planning to leave enough money to cover his bill and the usual generous tip for Rose. The leaver's hand came down on the newspaper, his knuckles white. "Seems to me you're a bit confused about where you belong," he growled, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear the hatred in his words. Rose stood behind the counter, her hand hovering over the phone. The local police station was just 10 minutes away, but she knew that could be an eternity in situations like this. Phil, the cook, had moved closer to the prep window, a heavy spatula gripped tightly in his hand. "I belong exactly where I am," Mr. Wilson replied, looking directly at the leader for the first time. His eyes, sharp from decades of spotting trouble in a crowded classroom, met the biker's gaze without flinching. "I've been having breakfast in this booth every morning for 15 years. The biker with the bandana snickered, moving to block the end of the booth more completely. "Times change, old man. Maybe it's time for you to find a new breakfast spot." The few remaining customers in the diner sat in paralyzed silence. Mrs. Chen had tears in her eyes, her phone now forgotten in her hands. Bob, the retired mailman, had half risen from his stool, his face a mask of conflict between wanting to help and knowing he'd only make things worse. Mr. Wilson's phone still lay on the table, the screen showing his recent call. The leader noticed it, a cruel smile spreading beneath his thick beard. He reached for the device, but Mr. Wilson's hand got there first, calmly sliding it into his pocket. "That was my son," Mr. Wilson said, his voice carrying just a hint of something that made the bandana-wearing biker shift uncomfortably. "He's going to be disappointed if his breakfast plans are interrupted." The third biker, the one with the shaved head, laughed. "Ain't nobody coming to help you, Pops. Your boy's probably too scared to show his face around here anyway." Mr. Wilson stood slowly, his movements careful but not fearful. At his full height, he was still shorter than the bikers, but something in his posture made the leader take half a step back. There was a quiet dignity in the way he straightened his jacket, adjusted his glasses, and picked up his half-empty coffee cup. "Young man," he said, addressing the leader with the same tone he used on countless troublemakers in his classroom, "I've spent my life teaching people about history, about the mistakes we've made as a society, and how each generation has the chance to do better than the last. Right now, you're on the wrong side of history." The leader's face darkened with rage. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone he thought he could intimidate. His hand clenched into a fist, and Rose gasped, finally picking up the phone to dial. "You've got a lot of nerve, old man," the leader snarled, stepping closer. The other two moved in as well, creating a tight circle around Mr. Wilson's booth. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the diner floor, three dark shapes surrounding a single upright figure. But Mr. Wilson noticed something the bikers didn't. Through the window behind them, he saw a black SUV pull into the parking lot. Its driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, tall, powerful, moving with the kind of precision that only comes from years of professional training. The bell above the diner's door chimed again, but this time it sounded different. Not the harsh jangle of the biker's entrance, but a clear, decisive ring. The leader was so focused on intimidating Mr. Wilson that he didn't notice how his companions suddenly stiffened, their eyes widening at whatever they saw behind him. Mr. Wilson allowed himself a small smile, taking a final sip of his coffee before setting the cup down carefully on the table. He knew what was about to happen, not because he was afraid, but because he had complete faith in the person who had just walked through that door. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, straightening his tie, "I believe you're about to meet my son." Three men stood over a peaceful older man's table, their intentions as clear as the hatred displayed on their patches. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had no idea who was about to walk through that door. The diner door closed with a soft click that somehow seemed louder than when the bikers had slammed it earlier. The morning sunlight streamed in behind the new arrival, casting his shadow long across the checkered floor. He stood just inside the entrance, taking in the scene before him with the practiced eye of someone trained to assess threats in seconds. Mr. Wilson's son carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a military man. His stance was relaxed but ready, his eyes sharp and alert as they moved from his father to the three bikers. He wore civilian clothes, dark jeans and a plain black t-shirt that did little to hide his muscular frame, but everything about him screamed professional soldier. The biker with the bandana noticed him first, his sneer faltering as he registered the newcomer's presence. The one with the shaved head turned next, and something in his expression made the leader finally look over his shoulder. The atmosphere in the diner shifted instantly, like the moment when storm clouds suddenly reveal just how dark they've become. Rose stood frozen behind the counter, the phone still in her hand, 911 already dialed but not yet called. Mrs. Chen had covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide. Bob, the retired mailman, sat perfectly still at the counter, recognizing the look of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Mr. Wilson's son took 3 measured steps forward, his boots silent against the linoleum floor. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years training for moments exactly like this. His face remained calm, but his eyes, exact copies of his father's, held an intensity that made the bikers unconsciously shift their weight backward. "Good morning, Pop," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent diner. "Sorry I'm a little early for breakfast." He didn't raise his voice, didn't make any aggressive moves. He didn't have to. The quiet confidence in his tone spoke volumes about his capabilities. The leader, trying to maintain his authority, turned fully to face the newcomer. "This ain't your business, boy," he growled, but his voice lacked the certainty it had held moments ago. Mr. Wilson's son smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Actually, sir, you made it my business the moment you decided to threaten my father." He took another step forward, his movements measured and precise. "I've spent the last 15 years as a Force Recon Marine, specializing in close-quarters combat and threat neutralization. Would you like me to demonstrate?" The biker with the bandana swallowed hard, recognizing the calm certainty of someone who had faced far worse threats than 3 bullies in a diner. The shaved-head biker glanced at the door, clearly calculating his odds of making it there before something unpleasant happened. "Now," the son continued, his tone conversational but carrying an edge of steel, "I'm going to give you gentlemen a choice. You can walk out of here right now, get on your bikes, and never show your faces around here again." Or he left the sentence hanging, but his slight shift in stance made the alternative crystal clear. The leader, desperate to save face, took half a step forward. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you," he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Mr. Wilson's son actually chuckled at that, though the sound held no humor. "Sir, I've spent more time in combat zones than you've spent riding that bike. I faced down actual terrorists who were better armed and better trained than you." He paused, letting that sink in. "But if you really want to test your odds, I should warn you. I just finished my morning workout, and I could use the cool-down exercise." The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. In that golden light, the 3 bikers suddenly looked smaller, their tough guy facade crumbling under the steady gaze of someone who had faced real danger and emerged victorious. Phil, the cook, had set down his spatula and was now leaning against the counter, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Rose had finally lowered the phone, recognizing that the situation was well in hand. Even Mrs. Chen had uncovered her mouth, her expression changing from fear to something approaching admiration. Mr. Wilson calmly picked up his newspaper, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. He looked at the bikers, then at his son, and smiled warmly. "I believe my boy just offered you a choice, gentlemen. I suggest you take the easier option. He can be quite persistent when it comes to protecting family." The leader looked at his companions, seeing his own uncertainty reflected in their faces. His carefully constructed image of power and intimidation had been dismantled in minutes by someone who knew what real strength looked like. Without another word, he took a step backward, then another, his companions already moving toward the door. The bell chimed 3 times as they left, their exit considerably hastier than their entrance had been. Through the window, the diner's customers watched as they mounted their bikes and roared away, their earlier bravado replaced by the desperate need to be anywhere else. Mr. Wilson's son waited until the sound of motorcycles had faded completely before turning to his father with a warm smile. "So, Pop," he said, his voice now full of genuine affection, "how about that breakfast?" The tension in Pete's diner dissolved like morning mist in sunlight. The The sound of motorcycle engines had long faded, replaced by the familiar comfort of sizzling bacon and clinking coffee cups. Mr. Wilson's son pulled up a chair to his father's booth, his military alertness softening but not completely disappearing. Old habits die hard when you've spent years in combat zones. Rose hurried over with a fresh pot of coffee, her hands still trembling slightly but her smile genuine. "This one's on the house," she said, filling both their cups. "For both of you." Her voice carried the gratitude of everyone in the diner. "That's kind of you, Rose," Mr. Wilson said warmly, "but we'll pay just like always." His son nodded in agreement. Neither man was looking for special treatment or attention. They simply wanted their peaceful breakfast routine. The other customers gradually returned to their own conversations, though many kept glancing over with a mixture of admiration and curiosity. Bob, the retired mailman, raised his coffee cup in a silent salute from his spot at the counter. Mrs. Chen had already called the flower shop next door, and the story was spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. "You didn't have to come rescue your old man," Mr. Wilson said quietly, stirring sugar into his coffee. "I was handling it." His son smiled, a genuine warmth replacing the steel that had been in his eyes moments ago. "I know you were, Pop. I've seen you handle tough situations before. Remember when you talked down those two kids who were about to fight in your classroom? You never raised your voice once." "Different times," Mr. Wilson chuckled, but his eyes showed pride in his son's memory. "Though I suppose some lessons about handling bullies never change." Phil appeared from the kitchen with 2 plates piled high with breakfast, eggs over easy, crispy hash browns, and toast buttered just right. He set them down with a proud nod. "Special of the day," he announced, though everyone knew these perfectly cooked meals weren't on any menu. "Thank you, Phil," the son said, recognizing the gesture for what it was, not just gratitude, but acceptance. He'd been away serving his country for so long, but here in his father's favorite diner, he was still part of the community. As they began to eat, the morning sun streamed through the windows, warming their booth. The familiar tastes and smells brought back memories of countless father-son breakfasts shared in this very spot. Before deployments, after homecomings during leaves, this booth had been their special place. "You know," Mr. Wilson said between bites, "I taught history for 30 years. Saw all kinds of changes in this town. Some good, some not so good." He paused, looking at his son with pride. "But watching you handle those men today, that's the kind of change I always hoped to see. Standing up for what's right without throwing a single punch." His son nodded thoughtfully, cutting into his eggs. "The best victories are the ones where nobody gets hurt, Pop. That's something else you taught me. Along with dignity, respect, and standing your ground without losing your humanity." The diner had returned to its normal morning rhythm, but something had shifted. The regulars chatted quietly about what they'd witnessed, not just the confrontation, but the power of family bonds, the strength that comes from dignity rather than force, and the importance of standing together against hatred. Rose came by with more coffee, lingering a moment longer than usual. "Your father's been coming here every morning since before I started working here," she told the son. "Always has a kind word for everyone, always leaves a generous tip. Now we know where you got your good manners from." The son smiled, remembering all the lessons his father had taught him long before the Marine Corps added its own. "He's the real hero," he said quietly. "Fighting hatred with wisdom, teaching kids to be better than the generation before them." I just followed his example. Through the window, they could see the neighborhood coming to life. The morning rush was starting, with people hurrying to work or school. A few passers-by waved through the window, having already heard snippets of what had happened. News traveled fast in their community. Mr. Wilson finished his toast and dabbed his mouth with a napkin. Some habits of propriety never changed, even after facing down 3 angry bikers. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think those men might have learned something today. Not just about misjudging people, but about the strength that comes from doing what's right." His son reached across the table and squeezed his father's shoulder gently. "They learned what I've known all along, Pop, that true strength isn't about size or numbers or intimidation. It's about standing tall in the face of wrong, just like you've done your whole life." The morning continued to unfold around them as father and son shared their delayed breakfast, their bond stronger than ever. The incident would be talked about in Pete's Diner for years to come, not just for the drama of the confrontation, but for the quiet dignity of a father and the protective love of a son who had learned his lessons well. The story of what happened at Pete's Diner spread through the community like a gentle ripple in a pond. By lunchtime, the small restaurant was busier than it had been in years. People came not just for the food, but to show their support and to share their own stories with Mr. Wilson and his son. Young parents brought their children in, pointing out the corner booth where an elderly teacher had stood his ground with dignity and where his son, a Marine, had shown that true strength comes from restraint rather than violence. The kids listened wide-eyed as Phil, still working the grill, added little details about how calm and collected both men had been. "You should have seen it," Bob told anyone who would listen from his usual spot at the counter. That young man walked in like he owned the place, but not in a bad way. More like he knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. The retired mailman's hands would shake a little as he described the scene, still amazed by what he'd witnessed. Mrs. Chen had returned from her flower shop with a beautiful arrangement for the diner. For peace and unity, she said simply, placing it on the counter where everyone could see. The bright colors seemed to make the whole place more cheerful, as if nature itself was celebrating the morning's victory over hatred. Around 2 o'clock, the local police chief stopped by. He'd heard about the incident and wanted to check on things personally. He sat down with Mr. Wilson and his son, notebook in hand, but ended up staying for pie and coffee as they talked about the community and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. "We've had reports about that group causing trouble in other towns," the chief explained, sipping his coffee. "But nobody's been willing to stand up to them before. What you did here today, it's given other people courage. We've already received calls from witnesses of their previous activities who are now ready to come forward." Mr. Wilson's son listened intently, his military training evident in the way he absorbed and processed the information. "Sometimes people just need to see that it's possible to stand up to bullies," he said thoughtfully. "That you don't have to match their hatred with more hatred." Rose, who had been working the busy lunch shift without complaint, brought over fresh coffee for everyone. Her earlier fear had been replaced by a fierce pride in her workplace and her community. "You know," she said, refilling their cups, "I've been serving coffee here for 12 years, and I've never felt as safe as I do today. Not because of what could have happened, but because of what did happen, people standing together." Throughout the afternoon, former students of Mr. Wilson's kept dropping by. Some he hadn't seen in years, but they all had stories to share about how his lessons, both in history and in life, had shaped their own views on right and wrong. One woman, now a teacher herself, brought her young daughter in specifically to meet him. "I want her to know what a real hero looks like," she explained, her eyes misting over. "Someone who stands up for what's right, day after day, year after year, not just in big moments but in small ones too." Mr. Wilson's son watched these interactions with growing understanding. He'd spent years in combat zones, facing obvious enemies and clear threats. But his father had fought a different kind of battle right here at home, the daily struggle to teach young minds about justice, equality, and the importance of standing up for what's right. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the diner's windows, a local reporter showed up, having heard about the morning's events. Instead of sensationalizing the confrontation, she focused on the community's response, how a potential moment of violence had been transformed into one of unity and strength. "Would you say you were afraid?" she asked Mr. Wilson, pen poised over her notepad. The elderly teacher smiled gently. "Fear is natural," he replied, "but letting fear control your actions, that's a choice. I've spent my life teaching young people about the importance of choosing what's right over what's easy. Today, I simply had the chance to demonstrate that lesson one more time." His son, sitting beside him in the booth that had now become something of a landmark, added quietly, "The Marine Corps taught me how to fight, but my father taught me when not to. That's often the harder lesson." The reporter looked thoughtful as she wrote that down. "And what would you say to others who might face similar situations?" "Stand tall," Mr. Wilson said firmly. "Remember that dignity is not something others can take from you, only something you can give away. And most importantly, know that you're not alone. Community means standing together, supporting each other, being stronger together than we are apart." The diner had maintained a steady stream of customers all day, not just locals but people from neighboring towns who had heard the story and wanted to show their support. Phil had to send out for extra supplies twice, but nobody heard him complain once. As evening approached, the crowds finally began to thin. The golden light of sunset filtered through the windows, catching the steam rising from fresh coffee cups and making the whole scene feel almost magical. Mr. Wilson and his son remained in their booth, greeting well-wishers and sharing stories with anyone who stopped by. "You know, Plop," the son said during a quiet moment, "I think those bikers actually did us a favor today." They reminded everyone what this community stands for and what it stands against. Mr. Wilson nodded, looking around at the diner that had been his morning sanctuary for so many years. "Sometimes," he said wisely, "it takes a moment of darkness to help people see their own light." A week had passed since the incident at Pete's Diner, but its impact continued to ripple through the community. The morning sun still streamed through the same windows, but something had changed in the way people carried themselves when they walked through the door. There was a new sense of pride, of belonging, of standing together against hatred. Mr. Wilson sat in his usual booth, sipping his morning coffee, but he was no longer alone. His son had extended his leave, deciding that some things were more important than rushing back to base. They'd made it their routine to share breakfast every morning, just like they used to years ago. "You know what surprised me most about that morning?" his son asked, spreading butter on his toast. "Not those bikers, not the confrontation. It was watching how everyone came together afterward. That's the kind of thing you don't see much in the military, the quiet strength of ordinary people standing up for what's right." The diner had become something of a local landmark. Phil had hung a new sign in the window that read, "All are welcome here," and he meant it. The breakfast crowd had grown more diverse over the past week, with people from all parts of town feeling safe and welcomed in the warm atmosphere. Rose moved between tables with her coffee pot, but her step had a new confidence. She'd started taking evening classes in law enforcement, inspired by how one person's calm strength could make a difference. Sometimes, she told her customers, you just need to see it's possible to stand up to bullies. Then you find your own courage. The local paper had run a front-page story about what happened, but they focused on the aftermath rather than the confrontation. They wrote about how the community had come together, how Pete's Diner had become a symbol of unity in a divided world. The reporter had captured Mr. Wilson's words perfectly. Change doesn't always come from big gestures. Sometimes it comes from small moments of courage, from people choosing to do what's right instead of what's easy. The story had reached beyond their small town. Other communities facing similar problems had reached out, asking for advice on how to stand up to hatred without resorting to violence. Mr. Wilson and his son had been invited to speak at local schools, sharing their experience and the lessons learned. "You're becoming quite the celebrity, Pop," his son teased, watching as another customer stopped by their booth to shake his father's hand. Mr. Wilson smiled, adjusting his glasses. "Not a celebrity," he corrected gently, "just a teacher. Some lessons are taught in classrooms and some are taught in diners. The important thing is that people are learning." The bikers never returned to Pete's, but their actions had sparked something unexpected. The incident had exposed other stories of intimidation in nearby towns, and people were finally speaking up. The local police had made progress in addressing similar groups, armed with witness statements from those who had found their courage to come forward. Bob, still holding court at his usual spot at the counter, had become the unofficial storyteller of what happened that day. But his story had evolved. He talked less about the confrontation itself and more about what it meant, how one moment of standing up for what's right could inspire others to do the same. Mrs. Chen's flower shop next door had started a tradition of bringing fresh flowers to the diner every morning. "For beauty," she would say, "because where there is beauty, there is hope." The bright blooms seemed to capture the spirit of change that had taken root in their community. One morning, a young family that had been present during the incident returned to the diner. Their little one, who had been learning to use a fork that day, ran up to Mr. Wilson's booth with a drawing. It showed the diner with a rainbow above it and stick figures of all colors holding hands. "My teacher asked us to draw our happy place," the child explained proudly. Mr. Wilson's son watched the interaction with misty eyes. He'd seen a lot in his military career, both the worst and the best of humanity. But here, in his father's favorite diner, he was witnessing something special: the quiet power of everyday people choosing to stand together against hate. The evening news had picked up the story too, but they found something different to focus on. Instead of sensationalizing the confrontation, they highlighted how the community had transformed a potential moment of violence into an ongoing movement of unity and support. As the weeks passed, Pete's Diner became known as more than just a place for good coffee and breakfast. It became a symbol of what was possible when people chose dignity over fear, unity over division, and love over hate. The corner booth where Mr. Wilson sat every morning became known as the Wisdom Booth, though he would just shake his head and smile at the nickname. You know what the best part of all this is? His son asked one morning, watching the diverse crowd of customers sharing breakfast and conversation. It's not just about what happened that day. It's about what happens every day since, people choosing to be their best selves, treating each other with respect, standing up for what's right. Mr. Wilson nodded, looking around at the diner that had become so much more than just his morning coffee spot. "That's how real change happens," he said softly. "Not in big, dramatic moments, but in the small choices we make every day. In choosing to meet hatred with dignity, fear with courage, and division with unity." The morning sun continued to stream through the windows of Pete's Diner, but now it shone on something greater than just a local breakfast spot. It shone on a community that had learned the most important lesson of all, that the power to stand up against hatred lies not in fists or force, but in the quiet strength of people standing together, choosing love over fear, day after day after day.